take a breath. Get comfortable tonight. We're unlocking a forgotten drawer in history's quiet cabinet. You might not know what's inside, but I promise it hums with stories. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sky shifts like wool, being dyed slow, uneven, and somehow deeply personal. You're standing in the middle of a muddy path, skirts heavy with the morning's damp, when you notice the light dim. Not just a passing cloud, not the hush before dusk. No, this is the kind of darkness that makes animals restless, and old women start to murmur. One breath later, the wind changes, and someone calls your name, except it's not friendly, not curious. Just the start of something you won't be able to stop. It started as many terrible things do with a storm. Rain that came too fast, hail that flattened the barley before it could ripen, and thunder that cracked across the valley like God slamming a door. Of course, storms are natural, except when they're not. Especially not when they arrive just after you walked home from the well, your scarf flapping like a banner behind you. It was red. That didn't help. In this village, the color red is for saints and warnings, and you are definitely not a saint, so they start whispering. Nothing direct. Just the careful coughs when you pass. The way the baker counts change twice when you're the one buying stale rye. One of the older women mutters that your scarf called the clouds. You want to laugh, but you know better. Laughter can be dangerous in a place where thunder is louder than truth. Storms, you see, were never just weather in the medieval imagination. They were messages, punishments, a divine post-it note from heaven's angriest clerk. When crops failed or roofs collapsed, it couldn't possibly be the fault of poor construction or planting late. No, someone had tempted the sky. Someone had made heaven notice. And heaven, unfortunately, had very bad eyesight. Here's a strange detail. In certain towns, people believed that if you stirred soup widdershins, that's counterclockwise, you could raise a wind that would blow for 3 days. Don't believe it. Try saying that with a straight face to a man whose roof just landed in a tree. The truth is, storms were terrifying because they reminded people how small they were. And small people like to blame someone smaller. Enter you, a woman, alone, with a habit of humming to herself, and scandal of scandals, a scarf the color of sin. You didn't summon the storm, obviously. You just happened to be visible when it arrived. It's not about guilt. It's about proximity. The same way a toad in your garden might suddenly be seen as your familiar, or a cat at your window becomes a spy for the devil. You are too easy to locate, too easy to accuse. There's a curious academic debate buried under all this mud and superstition. Were medieval accusations against women rooted in fear of nature or fear of the unnatural? Some scholars say women were blamed because they were seen as closer to nature, and nature is chaotic. Others argue women were considered unnatural, defying their proper role, stepping beyond their God-given place, and thus inviting divine punishment. Either way, the result was the same women caught the blame for everything that couldn't be understood. And here you are, understood, least of all. That night, the village meets in the chapel. Not officially. Just one of those accidental gatherings that happens when people carry lanterns and complaints in equal measure. They mention the cow that slipped and broke its leg, the roof that collapsed, the child who caught a fever. And somehow, by the end of the discussion, your scarf is brought up more times than the Virgin Mary. You're not arrested. Not yet. But someone throws a stone at your doorstep. And when you open your shutters the next morning, you find your bucket has been turned upside down and filled with ash. Not subtle, not poetic, just a message. You consider leaving, but where would you go? The next village has its own storms, its own women to blame. And besides, you haven't done anything wrong. You just wore red. Still, you take the scarf off, fold it away, tuck it into the corner of your chest where old things go to sleep, memories maybe, or dignity. You tell yourself it's just cloth. It doesn't mean anything. But a part of you whispers, if it didn't mean something, they wouldn't be afraid of it. The storm passes. The sun returns. The barley tries again. People forget as people do. But you don't. Because once the sky has looked at you sideways, you never stop watching it back. You keep your eyes low now when you walk through the village, not out of shame, but because you've learned it's safer to observe than to be observed. The hens still cluck at your feet. The baker still sells you bread. But something is different in the way people blink when they see you. Like they're unsure if you're still entirely human or just mostly. It's a fine line in the Middle Ages between woman and warning sign. One foot in the kitchen, the other in a cloud of suspicion. And while no one says the word witch not out loud, at least they don't have to. The air says it for them. Let's be clear about something that historians know and whisper to each other over dusty bookshelves. Most accusations against women in medieval Europe didn't come from some grand inquisition or dark-robed men reading from Latin texts. They started at home, in the fields, in the marketplace. Ordinary people casting not spells, but blame, which is a much older magic. All it took was a crooked glance or a sickly cow, and suddenly you were the cause of the rot in the grain. And if you spoke up worse, silence was safety. But silence also became suspicion. You see the trap here, don't you? Here's the odd little detail. For tonight, there were actual laws in certain towns that allowed villagers to test whether someone had caused a storm by throwing them into a river. If they floated guilty. If they sank well, your name would be cleared, assuming you survived long enough to hear it. Not the most elegant system, but terribly efficient for getting rid of inconvenient women. So, you learn to adapt. You hang your washing at night so no one sees what colors you wear. You avoid singing in the morning lest someone thinks your voice is coaxing something unnatural from the well. And most importantly, you stop being helpful. You used to offer herbal infusions for coughs, dried rosemary for fevers. But now, no. That's the kind of thing that makes people ask where you learned it. And if you say, "My grandmother taught me," they might ask where she is buried. And then what? Even kindness becomes a liability. That's the cruelest part, perhaps. The way survival demands you hollow out the very parts of yourself that once brought joy. The laughter, the generosity, the odd little traditions passed down by women whose names were never written down. You pack them away like winter cloaks, hidden until it's safe again. Whenever that might be. There's another academic tangle we could pull at here. Were these suspicions a backlash against female knowledge or female independence? Maybe both. A woman who knew how to heal was frightening, yes, but a woman who didn't need a man to tell her what herbs were safe, downright scandalous. And so the stories keep piling up like smoke in a low-ceilinged cottage. There's the miller's wife who looked too long at the priest's ox before it dropped dead. There's the shepherd girl whose hair was too dark to be natural. There's the widow who kept bees and was blamed for a summer without honey. Patterns emerge, and not the comforting kind. But you are still here. One night, as you gather nettles in the dark, quietly, carefully, you hear footsteps on the path behind you. Your heart does the thing. It always does. It stops, then hammers, like it has something to prove. It's just a boy, barefoot, eyes wide. He looks at the basket in your hand and says, "Will that fix my mother's cough?" You almost say no. Almost pretend you're someone else entirely. But something in his voice sounds like the wind when it's trying to be gentle. And so you nod. You show him how to steep the leaves, not boil them. You tell him to add honey if they have any, but not to expect sweetness right away. He thanks you, like he's afraid you might vanish. You walk home slower that night. The basket a little lighter, your chest a little heavier, because you know you're not supposed to care. You're not supposed to risk it. But what's the point of knowing things if you let them rot with you? That's the strange paradox of women in this age. You are expected to know everything about keeping people alive, cooking, cleaning, birthing, grieving. But if you know too much, suddenly you're dangerous. Suspicion sticks like wet wool, and there's no fire hot enough to dry it, so you keep walking the line. You listen more than you speak. You offer help only when no one sees. And if they do see, well, maybe they'll remember the storm and be too afraid to ask. Or maybe not. Maybe one day they'll ask too many questions. Maybe your name will be the next one whispered beside phrases like unnatural or unlucky. But not tonight. Tonight the sky is clear. The stars blink like curious eyes. And for once, no one is watching you with fear. Just the night, and the wind, and your breath quiet in the dark. You wake before the sun, not because you're pious or punctual, but because the wind has worked a hole in the roof again, and a steady drip has been tapping your forehead since midnight. The straw mattress beneath you is damp, your toes are cold, and a spider the size of a copper coin is quietly plotting its next ambush in the rafters. Morning comes not with birdsong, but with creaking wood, aching joints, and a kind of resignation that feels almost sacred. The cloister bell hasn't rung yet, but your body knows its rhythm by now. You could rise and fall with its tones without ever hearing them. It's a strange comfort, this routine, almost like safety, until you remember that nothing is truly safe when you're a woman known for asking too many questions. Today, you'll sweep the hallways again. Not because they're dirty, though they always are, but because movement helps quiet the thoughts. There's something about the rhythm of the broom, back and forth, that lets the mind wander while the body pretends to be useful. Sometimes it's in those slow, repetitive tasks that you uncover truths no one wrote down. Like this one, no one trusts a woman who knows how to read weather. You'd think it would be a skill, welcomed in a time when crops lived or died by the turn of the wind. But if a woman could look at the clouds and say, "It will hail before sundown," and then it did well, how did she know? And if she didn't warn them, was she to blame? That's the burden, isn't it? The unbearable weight of being both too useful and too dangerous. It's a familiar paradox in these narrow stone corridors. If you say nothing, you're a fool. If you say too much, you're a threat. And there is no middle ground for a woman whose eyes are open. You remember once years ago when you pointed out the odd formation of birds circling over the wheat fields. Storms coming, you said absently to no one in particular. The next day, lightning split the chapel roof. No one said it was your fault, not directly, but they looked at you differently after that, as if the storm had left a mark not on the roof, but on you. The funny detail, if anything about this is funny, is that medieval people did believe birds could predict the weather. But when that knowledge came from a woman instead of a priest, or a man with a beard long enough to hide behind, it was less wisdom and more worry. So now, you keep your observations to yourself. You still watch the skies, still mark the way the wind shifts the cypress trees, but you don't speak of it. You let the world guess, and you nod politely when others pretend to know what you've known since morning. It's a strange, quiet rebellion. Sometimes, Sister Claire sits beside you while you peel onions for the midday stew. She's old, her hands twisted like gnarled roots, and her voice always sounds like it's halfway between a hymn and a scolding. But she watches you with knowing eyes. "Storm in your bones again," she'll say, as if she's asking about the weather. And maybe she is. You never answer directly. You just smile and pass her another onion. Let the tears fall for you both. There's a question that rolls around in your mind, like a loose stone in your shoe. When did knowledge become a sin? Not the grand knowledge of monks and manuscripts, but the quiet kind. The kind passed from mother to daughter, whispered over herbs, measured by the palm stored in jars without labels. It was never meant to be powerful, only practical. But practicality is threatening when it comes from the wrong mouth. That's what you've learned. That a woman with knowledge must also possess an alibi. You're careful now, even with your own thoughts. You catch yourself before saying things like, "The wind smells of snow," or "This fever will break by morning." You pretend to be surprised when you're right. You feign ignorance when someone asks for help. You have become an actor in your own life, and the play never ends. But sometimes, when no one's watching, you let yourself remember who you are. You go to the herb garden at twilight, not for harvesting, those days are gone, but just to walk among the plants you used to tend. The sage is still strong. The lavender still leans toward the sun. You brush your fingers against the thyme just once. It's enough. In the silence, you hear a voice, your grandmother's maybe, or a memory stitched from too many stories. There's no shame in knowing things it says, only danger in who hears you say them. You stand a little straighter after that, not proud, just present. You've learned to survive, not by hiding who you are, but by folding it small, tucking it away where no one looks. Between the pages of Psalms, beneath the hem of your habit, behind your quiet eyes. And maybe one day, when it's safe, you'll let it bloom again. But tonight, you simply light a candle, say your prayers, and close your eyes to the drip still tapping the edge of your bed. The storm didn't come after all, or maybe it's waiting. Either way, you're ready. The cloister doesn't have seasons in the way the outside world does. Here, everything is stone shadow and the slow tick of prayer hours. But even within these walls, you know when summer begins, not because of sunshine, but because the air thickens with the smell of sweat, sour herbs, and secrets. You're in the infirmary again. Not because you're sick, though your hands ache from yesterday's washing. Know today you're helping Sister Winifred grind feverfew leaves into a bitter paste that no one actually wants to swallow. Still they will, because anything is better than being left to chance, or worse, left to God's will without a buffer. You don't say that out loud, of course. The sick room smells of vinegar mold and sheep tallow. You've gotten used to it, the way people get used to damp or disappointment. You wipe the sweat from your lip with your sleeve and pass Sister Winifred another rag to boil. She's muttering again. Something about humors being off. Something about the moon. You nod. Not because you understand, though you do, but because nodding is safer than talking. There's a girl in the far cot, no more than 12. She's burning up and mumbling in 3 languages, none of which she was taught. A week ago, she was climbing apple trees and shouting at goats. Now she glows with fever, like a saint in a stained glass window, and people are beginning to whisper. They don't say plague, not yet, but they glance at each other with the same fear as if the word were a bell about to ring. One sister swore the child floated off her mattress last night. Another claimed the crucifix on the wall turned upside down. You saw neither, but it doesn't matter. The question starts to hum just under the surface. Who brought this in? You know how this works. One illness, one drought, one mouse nibbling the wrong corner of the grain bin, and someone will be blamed. And if that someone happens to be a woman who knows how to make teas and poultices, a woman who read one too many recipes from that suspicious herbal book stored behind the altar, well, she'll be the storm in the well water. That's the historical truth no one likes to talk about when things went wrong. The blame slid downhill right into the apron pockets of the women nearby. It wasn't always dramatic. You weren't burned or tried. But maybe your name disappeared from the baking rota. Maybe your advice stopped being sought. Maybe someone moved your herbs from the chapel shelf to the compost pile and no one mentioned it. That's the quieter kind of punishment. The peculiar detail. The most trusted midwives and healers were often accused of witchcraft and called upon in the same breath. It's as if the world couldn't decide whether to kneel to you or silence you. And sometimes it tried both. Tonight you light a candle early. The girl's fever hasn't broken, and Sister Winifred is already working her way through prayers 3 levels deeper than necessary. You whisper instead to the herbs in the hanging bundle above the cot. Chamomile, yarrow, rue. The rue is what catches your eye. Old, stiff, and bitter as judgment. It was once worn by Roman senators to protect against poisons. Now it's just another thing to be blamed when healing doesn't work fast enough. You wonder not for the first time what makes a cure become a curse. Is it the failure of the medicine or the fear of the one who made it? Your academic brain still alive somewhere beneath the linen coif and sleepless nights wants to ask, how did women's knowledge of healing become entwined with the supernatural in a way men's never did? Why was it witchcraft when a woman boiled willow bark, but science when a man extracted salicylic acid? But that kind of thinking gets you in trouble. So instead, you wash another cloth in cold water and press it to the girl's forehead. Her eyes flicker. She mouths something that might be a prayer or a recipe. You pretend not to hear. Outside, the wind shifts. You don't need to look to know that tomorrow's air will be sharp with smoke. Not because of fire, but because someone will start asking questions. And the questions will not be kind. That's the thing about medieval blame. It doesn't come with evidence. It comes with timing and proximity. You were there, so you must be it. You lean against the stone wall and feel its cool weight steady your spine. There's comfort in stone at least. It doesn't whisper. You stay late in the infirmary, pretending not to watch the shadows, pretending not to notice that Sister Winifred has crossed herself more times than usual. When she asks if you've been brewing anything unusual lately, you smile and shake your head. And later, when you return to your cell and find your basket of dried herbs has been moved slightly, you don't ask who touched it. You just light your candle and hold your breath, because the fever may pass. But the suspicion that lingers longer than plague. You're back in the cloister garden, though. Garden might be a generous word for a space half choked by nettles and divine neglect. The herbs here know how to fend for themselves. In fact, some of them seem suspiciously good at it. You duck beneath the rosemary branches and eye the rue again, that stubborn sharp-leafed plant that heals as easily as it condemns. The sick girl lived. That's the good news. The bad news is someone saw you whisper over her. They didn't ask what you said. They never do. But one of the younger novices told another that you were muttering in Latin with your eyes closed, and that was enough. Word got around as word always does. You've been assigned to extra sweeping duty this week. A quiet message encoded in dirt. You're not surprised. It's happened before. And what's worse, you've learned that your silence only makes them more curious. So you talk. You talk about plants. Out loud. All the time. You become very boring. Very loud. Very knowledgeable about basil. It's a kind of camouflage, really. You tell anyone who'll listen how basil prefers indirect light and rich soil and hates cold air. You speak loudly about dill and its uses in digestion. You rattle off the recipe for lavender salve like a prayer. If they're going to watch you, you might as well give them something safe to see. And yet, underneath all that ordinary noise, you still feel it, that medieval cocktail of awe and suspicion, so often reserved for women who know things. Particularly, women who know things about the body. Because here's a quiet truth, that history often skips women's knowledge of healing wasn't always passed down in books. It lived in hands, in gestures, in the way you'd steep a leaf just slightly longer for a cough than you would for cramps. The timing wasn't written, it was inherited. And that kind of knowledge scares people, because you can't test it, you can't control it. You can only trust the one who holds it, and trust, especially for women, is rarely granted freely. Today, you're helping Sister Agnes dry marigold petals. She hums as she works a little off-key and tells you the same story she always tells, how the Virgin Mary once appeared to a woman in Italy and told her that marigold was a holy flower. You nod. She nods. You both pretend this is new information. The petals go brittle in the heat, and you gently scrape them into the clay bowl. It's peaceful for about 10 minutes, until Brother Matthew passes by. He's not supposed to be in the women's garden, but he's one of the scribes, and he likes to study nature, which seems to involve standing a bit too long near the hedge and squinting at you like you're part of the flora. Today he stops and asks what you're making. You say a compress for rashes. He says, "Ah, so you're an apothecary now." You smile. He doesn't. He walks away, muttering something about pride. That's when you remember pride is one of the sins. So is knowledge, apparently. Or at least the kind that doesn't come from the pulpit. You and Sister Agnes keep working in silence. Here's the peculiar bit: some of the clergy do want your help. You've overheard the priests asking about the tincture for headaches. You've even seen one of them sneak a bottle of valerian root from the infirmary shelf. But in public, you're just the woman with the herbs and the eyes that are maybe a little too steady. It's exhausting, this dance of usefulness and suspicion. So you turn to humor. That's the part no one tells. Humor is the best armor in a cloister. A well-timed joke can disarm a frown. A bit of sarcasm, served with a smile, can float right past the guards at the gate of suspicion. So, when someone asks what you're brewing, you say, "Only a potion for patience." Careful, it works too well. They laugh. Sort of. And you stay one more day off the gossip list. The academic question, buzzing at the edge of your thoughts, is this: how did humor become one of the few weapons medieval women were allowed to wield? Not sharp enough to be dangerous, not loud enough to be condemned, just enough to survive. The sun dips lower. The petals are dry. You carry them inside in your apron and leave a little trail behind gold dust marking your path. You're not a witch. You're not a saint. You're just a woman with a bowl full of flowers walking a very old line between remedy and accusation. You wake up to coughing. Not yours, someone else's. The dry, rasping kind that sounds like it's been stitched together from straw and old parchment. You know that sound. Everyone does. It's the cough that lingers in the corners of the dormitory, that echoes faintly in chapel when the incense gets too thick. It's plague season again. Or maybe just a bad cold. It's always hard to tell. The line between ordinary illness and divine punishment was never very clear in the Middle Ages, and it's even less so when you're half asleep and praying your lungs stay quiet. In the cloister, sickness spreads the way, rumors do quickly and without mercy. One sister sneezes, another faints, and suddenly everyone is fasting more and scrubbing their hands like it might save their souls. Today, the infirmary is full, and you've been assigned to help. The straw-stuffed mattresses are damp with sweat, and the smell of vinegar and rosemary oil clings to your clothes. You crush mint into boiling water and watch the steam rise, pretending you can banish fevers with the force of your stare. And overall, this one name hovers you, because, of course, someone remembers that you whispered over a bowl of thyme last week. Someone remembers that you made a paste for Sister Claire's aching knee. Someone remembers that every time you touch a plant, it does seem to help. So naturally, when people start dying, it must be your fault. Isn't that how it always goes? You're too good with herbs suspicious, too quiet suspicious, too familiar with the symptoms very suspicious. There's a woman in town who got accused of witchcraft because she kept feeding garlic to her sick husband. Garlic? The same thing Brother Matthew eats with his stew, though no one seems to question his motives. This is the absurdity you live in. You who spend your days cleaning wounds and boiling linens are considered more dangerous than the rats that run freely through the granary. No one blames the rats. But you knew what feverfew looked like. That's damning. Here's a strange little truth. Medieval medicine didn't really care whether something worked, only whether it came from the right place. If a nobleman brought you honey, it was a gift. If a woman made a honey salve, it was probably sorcery. And if a cure came from the wrong hands, even if it helped, it was still suspicious. You wipe sweat from a girl's forehead and offer her a prayer, not because you think it will fix her, but because it might ease her fear. Or yours. Or maybe it just fills the silence, The candle at the end of the bed flickers. Her eyes close. You stay until her breathing evens out. Then you step into the corridor and lean against the cold stone wall. You've started to dread the sound of your own name. It always comes in whispers lately, half hushed behind corners. She knows things they say. You do. But knowing isn't the crime. The crime is being you and knowing. If Brother Matthew had brewed that same tea, no one would blink. If he had spoken to the wind and said a few words in Latin, it would be called a benediction. But when you do it, it's a sign. The sky grumbles low with thunder, and someone mutters that it's a bad omen. Someone always does. Every cloud is an accusation. Every cough is a trial. And here's the question. You keep asking yourself, silently at night, when no one can hear. Why was the boundary between healer and heretic always so thin? And why was it always women who walked it? In the kitchen, the sisters are boiling more vinegar. The scent makes your eyes sting, but no one dares complain. Complaint sounds too much like doubt, and doubt is dangerous. You take your bowl of herb paste and walk to the next bed. The girl there has freckles and a look of deep, ancient worry. She's barely 12. She grabs your wrist and whispers, "Is it true that God punishes us with sickness?" And you, tired, splattered with sweat and oil and blame, want to say no. Sometimes it's just bad water, but instead you smile. You say, maybe it's the body's way of needing rest. And that seems to calm her. That's the real magic, maybe. Not the plants, not the salves, just kindness, consistency, presence. You sit by her bed and hum something tuneless. Your hands smell like time. Outside, the rain has begun, and behind it, you know there will be more whispers. But for tonight, you let them come. You are a woman with herbs and a soft voice, a healer, a threat, a comfort, all at once. The market square smells of damp wool, smoked fish, and something vaguely sour you'd rather not identify. You tug your cloak tighter and try not to step in anything that steams. It's Sunday, which means the bishop's representative is here, and that means everyone is performing piety just a touch louder than usual. Women bow a little deeper. Stallholders hum snatches of hymn tunes between sales, and somewhere off to the side, a girl pours out a bucket of rainwater with theatrical reverence, as if St. Peter himself is watching. The bishop's man has a beard like a broom and a stare like a blade. He's not from here, which is partly the problem. When strangers come to town, they bring new standards, new suspicions. They don't know who actually works hard, who helps the sick, who makes the best barley loaves. They only know what to look for: silence, independence, unwed women, the odd freckle pattern. You watch from behind your basket of turnips, trying not to look like someone who knows too much. It doesn't work. He walks past 3 others and stops at you. "Do you read?" he asks. Not "how are you not?" Is that your daughter clinging to your skirt? Not "are these turnips yours?" Just "do you read?" Because that somehow is more dangerous than anything else. You say no. Of course you do. You've said it your whole life, even though your uncle taught you to trace letters in the soot on his hearthstone. Even though you sometimes sneak peeks at the church scrolls when Sister Brigitte's back is turned. Even though words dance in your mind like old friends. But women who read are women who ask questions, and questions are rarely welcomed. At least not from your mouth. It's different when a monk wonders why the rains haven't come, or when a priest asks whether relics truly weep. But if you wonder aloud why all the plagues seem to follow the path of the tax collectors, well, suddenly you're drawing the wrong kind of attention. The bishop's man leaves without a word, but you feel his eyes long after he's gone. Later at the bread stall, someone whispers, "Careful with her. She has the look of a thinker." And that in medieval terms is not a compliment, it's a warning. You carry your basket home through the mist, wondering how many thoughts are too many, how much knowledge must be hidden to survive, and you think of the old stories, the ones where women whisper secrets into tree roots, because it's safer than saying them aloud, where a single word said too boldly could bring fire and rope. There's something particularly cruel about a world that teaches you how to notice but punishes you for noticing. You pass a woman selling herbs from a wheelbarrow. She's missing 3 fingers and wears a pouch around her neck that smells of wormwood and tallow. She nods at you. You nod back. It's a quiet kind of fellowship. An understanding built not on words, but on mutual risk. Both of you know that being helpful only counts when someone else decides it's acceptable. That a good deed can become a bad omen with enough gossip. That the line between saint and scapegoat is mostly a matter of timing. Back home, you hang your cloak by the fire and begin sorting your turnips. You press one to your cheek. It's cold but familiar, solid, unlike reputation. Reputation is wind and whispers. One moment, you're the woman who helped birth the blacksmith's son. The next, you're the reason his wife fell ill. You light a tallow candle and trace a word into the wax with your fingernail. It's just a name yours. It disappears, almost immediately melting into the surface. You smile not because it's funny, but because it's true. Words can vanish quickly when they're yours, but you remember them. And that, perhaps, is the most dangerous part. You remember what you saw, what you heard, what they'd rather you forgot. You wake to the sound of coughing wet ragged and much too close. It's not your own. It comes from the other side of the thin wooden wall that separates your family's bed from your neighbor's. No one knocks anymore when they need help. They just groan loud enough for someone to hear and hope a woman like you comes. You swing your legs over the side of the bed, feet hitting cold earth, and wrap yourself in a shawl that smells faintly of thyme and smoke. The herb scent isn't by accident. You stitched little bundles into the corners when the fever last came through. They didn't stop the sickness, but they made the dying smell sweeter. You carry a bowl of warm beer and elderflower and push open the door with your hip. The light inside is dim, one candle flickering like it's afraid. Your neighbor Marta lies curled under a blanket that's more holes than fabric. Her face is red and slick with sweat, but her lips are pale. You touch her forehead with the back of your hand and wince. She's burning from the inside out. The village priest says sickness is a test of faith. The hedge woman who lives near the woods says it's the result of dampness and bad humors. You think it might just be the fact that everyone shares one cup and never boils the well water. But you don't say that out loud. Instead, you lift Marta's head and help her drink. She doesn't open her eyes. On the wall above her hangs a sprig of dried rue tied with red thread. Superstition, they'd call it if it were on your wall. But because her husband hung it, it's just tradition. That's the difference, isn't it? When a woman uses plants, it's suspicious. When a man does, it's pious or practical. You sit by her side, wiping her face with a damp cloth, and remember the time you were accused of bringing illness just by walking past the baker's sick daughter. She looked too healthy, someone said, as if strength itself was evidence. It's a strange kind of math. If you survive something that others don't, you must have made a deal. With devils, with darkness, with something unholy. Why else would the pox spare you? Why else would your children live? They don't ask what you fed them, or how many times you woke in the night to check their breath. They just want to know if you've been speaking to owls, or if your herbs came from too far into the forest. You change Marta's cloth and hum an old lullaby, the kind that mothers sing when there's nothing left to do but wait. And you wonder, when did care become a threat? How did tending to the sick make you suspect? You think of the midwife who vanished last spring after someone found a poppet under her doorstep. Never mind that the poppet was just straw, or that her only crime was helping women give birth without screaming. People don't like what they don't understand, and worse, they fear what they do understand when it comes from someone they can't control. Your fingers brush the little pouch tied at your belt. Inside dried mint yarrow and 2 pieces of licorice root. You know their uses. You know which teas calm the belly and which stop bleeding. You also know that if you speak too confidently about them, someone might report you. It's a delicate game. Knowledge isn't forbidden exactly, but it is closely watched, especially when it works. Marta shivers under the blanket. You tuck it tighter around her and murmur nonsense just to fill the air, because silence in this moment feels too close to giving up. Outside, a rooster crows late and hoarse, like even it isn't sure of the day. You sigh. You still have to gather eggs, chop wood, and make bread before noon. But you stay a little longer, just until her breathing evens, just until she stops whimpering, just until the candle flickers again, as if relieved by your presence. You leave a clay cup by her side and whisper a quiet blessing, your own words, not the church's. They feel more honest that way. Back in your cottage, you start the fire again. The coals hiss, smoke curls, and you imagine just for a moment what it might be like to live in a time when women like you weren't feared for helping, when knowing how to heal didn't make you a danger, when your care wasn't something to be whispered about. You shake your head. Wishful thinking is its own kind of illness. But still, you tuck a fresh sprig of lavender above the door. Not because it's magic, but because it helps. And because sometimes being a little feared is safer than being entirely forgotten. There's a quiet rhythm to your hands. Thread loop pull, thread loop pull. The linen is rough, and the light from the oil lamp is barely enough to see by, but your fingers know the pattern by heart. You are mending again. Sock sleeves, a tunic that belongs to no one living, but might fit someone growing. You inherited the needle from your mother. She got it from her aunt. No one knows where it was forged, only that it still works and that its point is somehow sharper than most truths. It's late and everyone else is sleeping, or pretending to. That includes your husband, who snores with the conviction of a man who assumes nothing will be asked of him before dawn. You don't envy him. You just know there's no such thing as real rest when your day never truly ends. Women work in hours that don't belong to the clock, between sun and moon, between cries and silence, between the first stirring of dough and the last smudge of soot scrubbed from the hearth. The work you do now is called women's work, but it's a job that holds the village together. You are a mender of clothes, of tempers, of broken things, people think they can throw away. You remember when your neighbor's boy came to you with a broken sandal and eyes full of shame. You patched it with goat leather and twine, and he looked at you like you'd conjured a miracle. Maybe you had. Maybe survival is the closest thing to magic anyone really gets. The truth is, nearly every woman you know has a second job. Not official, of course. Just quiet little roles the world depends on, but never names. The widow who treats burns with vinegar and honey. The girl who speaks 3 dialects and translates for the traveling cloth seller. The old woman who knows which mushrooms not to eat. None of them get paid. Not in coin, but they're paid in secrets, in favors, in being slightly less expendable than they might have been. And sometimes they're punished for it too. Because people fear what isn't written down. They fear what isn't sanctioned by guild or priest. A woman who knows how to stitch a wound is useful until someone dies anyway. Then she's a suspect. A woman who remembers a remedy her grandmother whispered during the plague is wise until it works too well. There was a weaver, once 3 towns over, who knew how to blend bark with ash to dye cloth a vivid red. People came from miles away, until someone claimed she'd put a spell on her loom, that the colors came from blood, that she whispered to it at night. You never heard what happened to her. Just that no one dyes red there anymore. The line between talent and threat is drawn in the dust, and it shifts with every footstep. You pause your stitching to stretch your fingers. The joints ache more than they used to. You're not old, not yet, but the years settle into bones like sediment. There's a little jar of goose fat and marjoram by the hearth, your own concoction. You rub some into your knuckles. No one taught you the recipe. You just watched enough women try and fail and try again. It's a kind of inheritance, not the kind that's recorded or blessed, but the kind passed hand to hand, whispered from mouth to ear, embedded in muscle memory. You think sometimes, what if women's knowledge were valued? Not just tolerated, but recorded, preserved, studied. What would that world look like? Would you have a seat in a room with ink and scrolls? Would your remedies be written beside a monk's in the same careful script? Or would it still come down to who gets to hold the pen? Outside, a fox yips, and the geese start their complaining. You sigh and fold your sewing. The hem isn't perfect, but it's strong. That's all that matters tonight. Tomorrow, there will be more to patch, always more to mend. Clothes, moods, injuries, peace between sisters. But for now, you rest your hand on the worn wooden table and let the silence settle in. The oil lamp flickers, catching a glint of the thimble you dropped earlier. You pick it up, slip it onto your finger. A small, dented crown in a kingdom no one writes stories about, but one that would fall apart without you. The weather has turned again. You can tell without looking. The wind smells different, wet and sour, like old wool and spoiled onions. There's a pressure behind your eyes, and the chickens are restless, pacing their pen like monks who suspect a heresy is near. You step outside anyway, because bread doesn't care about storms, and neither does hunger. The sky is heavy with clouds that seem to sag, not float. You pull your shawl tight and make your way to the shed boots, sinking in the mud, with a sound that perfectly mirrors your mood. It's going to rain, or hail, or worse. And if the past has taught you anything, it's this: if something goes wrong, someone will blame a woman. It always starts the same way. A bad harvest, a sick cow, a child who won't stop coughing, and then the whispers start. The midwife used the wrong herbs. The widow doesn't go to mass. The girl who lives near the woods talks to cats. Before long, the gossip grows legs and stomps its muddy boots across someone's life. You've seen it before. You remember how 2 summers ago, a thunderstorm split the church steeple in half. Spectacular, biblical, terrifying. And by dawn, 3 women had been accused of inviting it. One of them had simply sneezed at the wrong moment. The notion that women control the weather isn't just superstition, it's a convenience. Because if a man is in charge and something goes wrong, the cause must be hidden, evil, feminine. Easier to blame a scowl than question the grain taxes. Simpler to burn the herbs than ask why the river runs dry. And the worst part, sometimes even you start to wonder, when the wind howls all night and the fire refuses to catch you, think, did I do something wrong? Did I forget a prayer? Offend a saint? Fail to bow deeply enough? The weight of centuries presses in, and it's shaped like your own guilt. You reach the shed. The door creaks like it's auditioning for a morality play, and inside, the sacks of barley have been chewed open. Rats. Of course. You could cry, but instead, you laugh quiet and bitter, like someone who's misplaced the line between humor and hysteria. You sweet patch mutter to yourself. You light a bit of dried sage, not because you think it'll drive the vermin out, but because your grandmother swore it calmed the nerves. And yours are wearing thin. Funny thing about curses, no one ever checks to see if they're just cause and effect. A spoiled batch of ale might be poor timing. A stillborn lamb could just be bad luck. But if a woman was nearby when it happened, well, that's a pattern. In truth, the real magic is how you survive the suspicion at all. You remember a girl from your village, barely old enough to bleed, who cried when she found a dead crow on her doorstep. She didn't know it was a warning. She thought someone had found a hurt bird and left it for her to fix. By the time the priest came, it was too late to explain. The bird had been a message, but not one she was meant to receive. The logic is always circular. If you know too much, you're dangerous. If you know nothing, you're suspicious. If you cry, you're hiding something. If you don't, you're cold. It's a trial you never chose with a jury you'll never see, and rules that change with the weather. Tonight you light the fire with care. You speak aloud, just softly, just in case, to the saints you were taught to trust. But you also slip a sprig of rosemary in the corner of the hearth, not for cooking, just for protection, or memory, or defiance. You stir the pot of lentils and watch the steam rise. Your hands still smell faintly of sage. The cat watches from the sill with narrowed eyes, like it knows something you don't. And maybe it does, because for all the sermons and scrolls, you've learned one truth that doesn't change. When people are afraid, they reach for blame. And the nearest, quietest woman will always do. You hum a lullaby as you clean the ladle. One your mother sang. The words don't rhyme. The tune doesn't soar. But it has kept you company through every false accusation the wind ever carried. And in a way, that's its own kind of magic too. You've never seen the sky so green before. It's the kind of color that should belong to moss, or the inside of an old apple, not to the heavens above your cottage roof. But there it is, sickly glowing, pulsing like a bad omen with wings. You don't need a priest or a poem to know something unnatural is coming. The wind picks up first, whistling low, encircling the corners like a dog sniffing out weakness. Then come the clouds rolling fast and low, like they've lost patience with the slow pace of peasant life. You've seen storms before. This feels personal. Everyone in the village has their own superstition for what turns the weather foul. The baker blames broken eggshells left open on the hearth. The shepherd swears that matted wool calls down lightning. But when the storm really breaks, when shingles start to fly, and the stream overflows its banks, it always ends the same way. They blame a woman, not a man who stole timber from sacred woods, not a landowner who overworked the fields until the soil turned to dust. No, somehow, it's always a woman with a mole or a limp or a little too much knowledge about herbs and stars. This time it's Margaret. She lives in a crooked cottage on the edge of the village, with 3 cats, a collection of oddly shaped rocks, and a past she never talks about. She once delivered a stillborn calf by hand and muttered a prayer that wasn't Latin. That's all it takes. No trial, no evidence. Just the right storm and the wrong face. You watch from a distance as they gather near her door. Men with muddy boots, women gripping rosaries too tightly. No one wants to say what's about to happen, but everyone knows. The air is thick with fear, and fear has a scent, sharp and metallic, like iron left too long in rain. Someone mentions a test, not the kind with parchment and ink. This one involves a river, a rope, and the kind of logic that would make a philosopher weep. If she floats, she's guilty. If she drowns, she's innocent. Either way, someone gets to feel righteous. You could speak up. Say that storms come whether Margaret chants or not, that rivers flood and winds howl without consulting the village calendar. But your voice has weight only within your own home, and even there, it's not as heavy as a man's. And so, you stay quiet. Maybe you whisper a prayer not in Latin either, just in the quiet language of breath and hope. Maybe you light a candle pretending it's for St. Swithin, but it's really for Margaret, and maybe for yourself too, because you know this storm will pass, but another will come. The truth is, medieval weather wasn't just about rain and wind. It was about punishment. God's punishment, nature's punishment, society's punishment, take your pick. And women conveniently were considered the most likely culprits. As if their very breath stirred up mischief in the clouds. You once overheard a traveling monk explain that Eve had brought about the fall of man, and so naturally her daughters would bring about the fall of weather. He said it like it was basic math, as though rain plus female sin equaled divine retribution. You wanted to ask, what equation explained sunshine? Here's the historical reality during times of crop failure plague or disaster. Communities sought scapegoats. Women, especially older ones, widowed ones, or ones who didn't fit into neat domestic roles, were easy targets. It wasn't always called witchcraft, but the bones of the accusation were the same. What's fascinating, though, is that these women weren't necessarily passive. Some leaned into the suspicion. They bartered their knowledge of herbs, their uncanny instincts about weather patterns, their talent with poultices, and in return, they earned bread and fear. Academic debate lingers. Was this proto-feminist resistance, or just survival, masked as mysticism? You think of Margaret alone with her cats and stones and soft-spoken ways, and you wonder if she ever regretted not smiling more. If she'd been cheerier, cuddlier, would they have believed the sky belonged to her god too? And here's the peculiar detail that keeps you up at night in one village account. A woman accused of causing a storm defended herself by claiming it was not she, but her goose, who had the true connection to the wind. They burned the goose. Now, as thunder rolls in the distance, and the trees sway like nervous parishioners, you wrap yourself in your cloak a little tighter. You tell yourself you're safe because you're quiet, you're obedient, you don't own cats or whisper to herbs. But somewhere deep down, you wonder what it would take for the village to look your way instead. Because in this world, the weather isn't just something you endure. It's something that watches, waits, and sometimes accuses. You know something's wrong the moment the crows change their flight. Not that you're an expert in bird behavior, but there's a rhythm to their daily chaos loops above the trees. Arguments on the thatch, a constant clatter of wings and scolding. But today, they're quiet. Too quiet. And that kind of silence in the medieval world usually means one thing: sickness is coming. It starts with a cough from the baker's son. Then the smith's wife faints by the well. Within days, doorways are marked with chalk, and no one wants to touch the church font anymore. The word plague isn't whispered. It's exhaled. Everyone knows what it means, and everyone knows who's to blame. Not the rats, not the fleas, not the questionable hygiene or shared ladles, or the time someone used dung as a poultice. No. Blame lands, as it so often does, on a woman. She's usually the midwife, the very one who nursed you through your fever last spring, who knows the smell of fevered sweat from 20 paces, who keeps dried rue and wormwood in her apron and mutters while she stirs. She's helpful until she isn't, because in the logic of fear, anyone with knowledge must also have control, and anyone with control must be suspicious. So when the child dies, any child, it's not God's will or bad luck. It's her. You remember the last time the fever came. They said it was the old herb wife's fault, that her teas were too bitter and her cures too strange. They made her stand in the churchyard while the priest shouted prayers in her direction like Latin might act as disinfectant. It didn't help. She still died. So did 5 others. Academic debates circle this like wary dogs. Was this fear of women's knowledge, or fear of women's independence, or fear that a woman with no formal training might hold power over life and death in a way no man could match? And here's where it gets odd. In some regions, women were accused of summoning illness through malice. In others, they were accused of withholding the cure. Either way, their silence or their speech was weaponized. You once heard of a woman who was blamed for spreading illness by walking too quickly down the lane. Her skirt had brushed against a sick cow the week before, and that was enough. She was told to crawl everywhere for a month. She did. Still got blamed when the priest caught a cough. No one wants to say it out loud, but everyone is keeping score. How many women fall sick compared to men? Why are the healers the first to be suspected? And why does knowledge in the form of boiled leaves and whispered prayers so often lead to punishment? You stir your own tea more slowly now. You say less when neighbors ask what you think about fevers or birthmarks. You keep your observations tucked behind your teeth. Not because you've forgotten how to help, but because you've learned when not to. The irony is many of these women weren't wrong. They knew about foxglove before it was called digitalis. They used honey to clean wounds long before anyone understood bacteria. They made poultices that worked. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough to frighten those who didn't understand the difference between a miracle and a method. And yet they were called poisoners, witches, temptresses of pestilence. You once watched an old woman be forced to burn her collection of dried herbs in the village square. The smoke smelled like rosemary and regret. Children laughed. One man said the burning would lift the curse. He coughed into his hand not 5 minutes later. You wrap your shawl tighter and light a candle not for saints, but for all the women who gave comfort in times of sickness and were rewarded with suspicion. There's something deeply unsettling about how quickly society turns on those who try to help, and even more unsettling about how gender decides who gets to hold knowledge without consequence. Maybe that's the root of it. Not the herbs, not the fever, not the rituals, but the discomfort of watching a woman hold a power that isn't decorative or domestic or sweet. A power that could, in theory, make her indispensable. And if history teaches us anything, it's this: indispensable women are rarely left in peace. So you cough once into the sleeve of your cloak. Just dust, you tell yourself. Just dust. But already someone is watching. You know better than to whistle while you spin, not because it's rude or unlucky, but because someone said once that it invites the devil to dance on your spindle. You didn't believe it, of course not at first, but that was before the cow stopped giving milk the same day you hummed an old melody at the well, before the neighbor's boy broke his ankle after chasing your shadow on a sunny afternoon, before someone looked at you, just looked and whispered, "She knows things." In a medieval village, knowing things is rarely a compliment, especially not when you're a woman. You learned that early, watching your mother go quiet when the priest walked past, watching her trade nettles for salt with the miller's wife with no words spoken, watching her kneel in the fields during a thunderstorm, arms open, praying not for safety, but not to be blamed when lightning struck something. There's something deeply suspicious about a woman who watches the sky. Storms, after all, need a reason. And if the crops fail, or the hay won't dry, or the river floods unexpectedly, it's not because of poor planning or the randomness of weather. No. It must be that someone called the rain, someone like you. You remember the woman, 2 villages over, who was accused of conjuring hail with her breath. She had simply sighed while weaving at dusk. That was enough. She was marched to the church and made to lie with her mouth in the dirt while it rained on her back. They said it cleansed the air. She never sighed again. Academic minds still argue whether these beliefs stemmed from folklore fear or just convenient scapegoating. But that doesn't help when you're the one holding the spindle and someone's chickens fall ill. And sometimes it wasn't storms. It was butter that wouldn't churn, ale that turned sour, bread that rose strangely. It's always easier to blame a woman than to admit that life is fragile. You've become careful with your words now. No compliments too sweet, no predictions too accurate. You keep your eyes lowered and your tone mild. You speak only in practicalities, because even praise can become a curse if someone's jealous enough. A young girl in your village once made the mistake of saying a pregnant cow looked healthy. That cow miscarried the next day. The girl's hair was cut short as punishment, and she was made to carry a stone in her apron for a week to weigh down the wind in her tongue, they said. You helped her wash her hair when the week was done. She never spoke aloud about animals again. You find yourself wondering how much silence was bred by fear, not by virtue. How many women swallowed observations, thoughts, or joy, just in case someone misunderstood it as a hex. The most painful part isn't the accusation itself. It's how quickly it comes. How swiftly a lifetime of kindness can be unraveled by one misfortune you couldn't possibly control. And still, they ask you to help. When the rain doesn't come, they knock on your door. When a child has night terrors, they ask if you know a charm. When someone's bread won't rise, they beg for your advice. But if it works too well, if the charm is too calming, the bread too light, the rain too timely, they whisper again. She must have called something to do that. Yes, you did. You called knowledge, experience, intuition passed down through the hands of mothers, grandmothers, women who never got to write it down but remembered anyway. You called skill, but that isn't what they see. They see a woman who might be more than just lucky, and that's dangerous. So you tread carefully. You keep your knowledge close and your weather predictions even closer. You only speak of the sky when it's blue. Because in this time, in this world, being right, too often, is just another way to be wrong. You're not sure when exactly the rules appeared, but they're everywhere. Not carved in stone, not even written in ink, but sewn into hymns, muttered beneath breath, passed from woman to girl, like a worn shawl that no one questions anymore. And one of the oldest rules is this: don't look too long at a man you're not married to. Don't meet his eyes. Don't laugh too loud. Don't linger near the well when he walks by, even if your bucket is only half full. The veil you wear, simple linen, maybe wool, if you're lucky, isn't just for warmth or modesty. It's a shield, or a warning, or both. Because in medieval towns and villages, a woman's glance can be loaded with suspicion. Too bold, and it's called flirtation. Too distant, and it's seen as contempt. Too thoughtful, and it's witchcraft. You walk through the market with your eyes lowered. Not because you have anything to hide, but because being unreadable is safer than being read wrong. The church encourages it, of course. Veils are a sign of humility, they say, of obedience, of feminine virtue. But they're also a way of hiding your face from the world that might blame you for the mere expression it finds there. You once smiled politely at the priest's apprentice while buying onions. By sunset, 3 women had asked if you were planning to marry. By sunrise, one had warned you that smiles invite demons. And so you began to practice a new face. Neutral, pleasant, but unremarkable. A face like an untouched wall there, but offering nothing. It's astonishing how much women were expected to disappear in plain sight. You think of Sister Genoveva, a nun in a nearby abbey, who was punished not for speaking, but for the way she looked at the abbess during Vespers. Too direct, they said, too knowing. She spent a week fasting in silence, staring at the ground. No rule had been broken, but rules in cloisters and outside them rarely needed ink to carry weight. In public, your headscarf does its job. It protects you from the sun, the dust, and the social danger of being seen too clearly. But what does it mean, really, when a culture fears a woman's gaze? Was it about modesty, or was it control? Scholars still debate this, whether veiling was a spiritual commitment or a social silencing, whether women were hiding from danger or being hidden as danger. You don't have time for debates, though. You have bread to buy, water to haul, eyes to avoid. You know when to pause at the bakery stall and when to pretend you didn't hear your name whispered behind you. You've learned that your safest face is one no one remembers. But even so, there are moments. A stolen second at the well. A flash of understanding shared across the market with another woman, also veiled. The eyes meet. And in that quiet, forbidden flicker of connection, you feel something ancient and human and dangerous stir. Recognition. It passes too quickly. Back to the onions. Back to the hearth. Back to the quiet choreography of appearing harmless. Because in this world, where storms are blamed on glances and plagues on pride, a single look can still be a revolution. You're mending a hem by firelight when it begins soft at first, like the low hum of bees in late summer. The chant of evening bells from the church tower echoing through the night air, like a memory you didn't know you had. You pause, needle halfway through wool, and listen. This sound, solemn, repetitive, holy, is meant to guide the faithful, to call them to prayer, to remind them of God. But to you, it's also a clock, a marking of time, not in minutes or hours, but in prayers, habits, and silences. It's strange, isn't it? How so many medieval women measured life not by what they said, but by what they didn't. Silence was virtue. Speech was risk. A woman too quick with words might be accused of gossip. A woman too learned might be accused of heresy. And a woman who asked too many questions might simply disappear. So you learn the language of quiet, a lifted eyebrow, a pause too long, a sigh, weighted like a stone. These become your grammar. You speak through actions, through glances, through the rhythm of your chores. It's not that women didn't have thoughts. It's that they became experts in tucking those thoughts into corners, into diaries if they were lucky, into margins of prayer books, into the fabric of tapestries. You remember hearing about a widow who stitched verses of Psalms backward into her weaving, not out of piety, but out of protest. No one noticed. Or maybe they did and chose to say nothing. That's the thing about silence. It can protect, but it can also erase. When the history books were written by men, mostly the quiet women didn't make much noise. But they were there holding everything together. Sometimes you wonder what might have happened if those women had shouted, if they'd stood in the marketplace and named every injustice. But then again, they might have been burned, or stoned, or simply laughed out of memory. So instead, they taught their daughters how to survive with their heads down and their minds sharp. They passed on wisdom through recipes, through lullabies, through warnings whispered at dusk. They knew that survival wasn't always about strength. It was about endurance, about knowing when to hold your tongue and when to use it like a blade. The bells continue. You thread the needle again. The hem is almost done. The silence wraps around you, like a blanket not comfortable, but familiar. You think of the women who came before you, who watched storms roll in and said nothing, who tended to the sick and were blamed for the plague, who prayed even as they were accused of causing the drought. You wonder if any of them ever got tired of being quiet, or if they found power in it somehow. Academics still argue about whether silence in medieval women was forced or chosen, whether it was submission or strategy. But here by the fire, with your needle and your thoughts, you know the answer isn't simple. Maybe it was both. Maybe silence was a prison, but also a shield, a weapon, a gift. One you never asked for, but have learned to wield all the same. Outside, the wind has picked up. The world keeps turning. The bells fade, and you finish your seam, tie off the thread, and fold the garment over your lap. Another task complete. Another wordless victory. You're gathering herbs beneath a waning moon, quietly, carefully, as if each leaf knows it is being watched. Mugwort yarrow, a sprig of rue. Not too much, not too bold. Just enough to dry in the eaves and call a remedy. Just enough not to raise suspicion. In the cloister garden, there's a spot behind the kitchen wall, where the good herbs grow, the kind that soothe fever, dull pain, steady a womb. You learned which from a sister long since passed, who used to hum as she worked, never once writing anything down. Because writing things down was dangerous. Knowledge, if it lived only in your head or your hands, could pass as intuition. But if it found its way into ink and parchment, well, then it could be cataloged, read aloud, judged, burned. And so, medieval women became walking libraries, not of philosophy or theology perhaps, but of what healed, what fed, what kept a body alive. It's odd how something as ordinary as rosemary or tansy could carry such weight. You remember the tale of a woman in Flanders, just a rumor maybe, who was accused of witchcraft because she cured a cough no one else could. Her real crime. She remembered too much, asked too few questions, knew how to make things better without anyone's permission, and so better became dangerous. Tonight, your fingers move automatically, brushing stems, tying bundles. The moon catches on the silver tips of the sage. You are not a witch, but you know full well that if things went badly, if someone's child took sick, or the priest got a rash, they'd come knocking. They always knock when things go wrong. This fear, subtle but constant, weaves itself into your work. Every remedy has to come with a little prayer. Not because you don't believe in the herbs, but because people believe in curses. So you pray. You mutter Deus Vult as you grind the elder bark just in case someone's listening. And in the quiet of your room later, you add honey. Because honey is healing, and besides, it tastes better than fear. They say knowledge is power. But in your time, knowledge is also suspicion. For men, learning earns respect. For women, it invites questions. How did she know that? Where did she learn it? Who taught her? And the worst of all, was it the devil? You laugh softly, bitterly, as if women need the devil to be clever. The debate continues in books written long after your bones are dust. Were women healers, legitimate medical practitioners, or folk frauds? Were they persecuted because they competed with male physicians, or because they dared to operate outside the church's reach? But here under the stars, you know the answer. You were never trying to compete. You were just trying to help. And for that, you kept one eye always over your shoulder. A neighbor once whispered to you in confession that she had bled for 7 days and feared she was cursed. You gave her mint and told her to rest. She wept not from the pain, but from the kindness. No one had treated her body like something worth healing before. That was months ago. She still leaves eggs by your door sometimes. You never speak of it. You finish your bundle, tie it with twine, and tuck it beneath your shawl. The wind is picking up. Dawn is still a few hours away, but the garden already smells like morning. You rise slowly, bones creaking, and take one last look at the herbs. They'll keep growing with or without you. Nature has no need for permission. As you walk back, your feet silent on the path, you think of all the other women like you, those who memorized cures, whispered instructions, hid salves in cooking pots. You think of their courage, wrapped in aprons and humility. You think of all the lives they saved and how few names we remember. There's a strange comfort in the idea that wisdom doesn't have to be loud to be real. That quiet hand steady in the dark have shaped more futures than anyone will ever count. And as you slip through the cloister gate, herb bundle pressed to your chest, you know you are part of that lineage. Not famous, not safe, but necessary. You're kneeling again, but this time it isn't in prayer. You're scrubbing the threshold of the manor house with coarse woolen cloth, your hands red from the lye, your knees numb from the stone. The Baron Steward has a theory that cleanliness pleases God and frightens away demons. Though oddly enough, only women seem to be chosen to perform the exorcism by bucket. As the sun climbs higher, the scrub water freezes in delicate threads along the cracks in the stone, and you wonder if you too will splinter one day. A passing boy calls you witch, just loud enough that it might be a joke, but not so loud that he can't deny it. You don't flinch. You're used to the sting of words that pretend to be wind. The truth is, women get called witches for all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do with spells. Be too quiet, and you're hiding something. Be too clever, and you're dangerous. Be too old, too poor, too sick, too unmarried, or worse, a widow, and you might as well walk around with a target stitched to your cloak. A woman once got accused simply because her cat sneezed during a thunderstorm. It didn't help that she muttered a prayer just before it started to hail. The town said she brought down the ice. No one asked whether the hail would have come anyway. Your own grandmother knew to never speak Latin in public, even if it was only the Pater Noster. People feared Latin in the mouth of a woman, the way they feared bees useful from afar, dangerous up close. She could recite entire psalms, but she did it under her breath while kneading dough. That way, the holiness stayed hidden, folded like butter into bread. You pause and stretch your back. The steward is watching, pretending not to. There's always someone watching. That's part of the cruelty, really. It's not the lashes or the stocks, though those exist too. It's the constant evaluation of your worth by people who believe you don't have any. People say women are too emotional to be trusted, but they trust you to nurse their babies, mix their herbs, tend their wounds, prepare their dead. They trust you with life and death, just not with a voice. A strange thing about the Middle Ages, the more invisible your work, the more dangerous your reputation. Spin too much thread without blinking. The devil guides your fingers. Spend too long by the fire after dusk. You're conjuring something. Laugh at a joke no one else hears. Clearly, you've been speaking to spirits. And heaven help you if you brew a tea that works. Cure someone's fever with elderflower, and suddenly you're dabbling in forbidden knowledge. A monk can experiment with leeches and poisons and be called curious. You, however, are unnatural. What makes it worse is that the boundary keeps moving. What's considered holy one year can become heresy the next, depending on who's in power or who got a bad harvest. A question lingers. Why were women always the ones blamed for imbalance? The weather fails, the cow dies, the child coughs too hard, and somehow the woman who said a prayer out of order must be responsible. Could it be that blaming a woman was simply easier than blaming God? Or was it that women's bodies, with all their unknowable bleeding and birthing, were never quite trusted to belong to this world at all? You wipe the sweat from your forehead with the edge of your sleeve, though the air is still cold. It's not the labor that exhausts you, it's the performance. You must always appear just pious enough to not attract attention, but not so pious that someone thinks you're using religion as camouflage. You must smile when spoken to, but not too eagerly. You must correct mistakes without making anyone feel corrected. You must never win, even when you're right. Especially then, some of the older women in the village know how to survive it. They wear their silence like armor. They answer questions with questions. They offer advice in riddles or sing their warnings into lullabies. One says, the wind doesn't need permission to howl. Another tells you, never plant garlic on a Thursday unless your neighbor is watching. You suspect these sayings aren't really about garlic or wind. Still you listen. You memorize them. You repeat them in your head when the world turns against you. You hum them while you scrub, while you stitch, while you survive. There's a chicken near your feet, now scratching at something invisible. It looks up at you with beady-eyed curiosity, the kind that feels too human. You wonder if it too would be accused of something if it laid the wrong egg on the wrong day. Then again, animals are rarely accused. They're not threatening in the same way. They don't carry knowledge in their bones. They don't bleed with the moon. Tonight, when you finally rest, you'll light the tiny tallow candle you've saved. It smells faintly of turnip and old wool, but it's light, and that's something. You'll whisper a prayer, not in Latin, but in the secret language of tired hands and quiet faith. And maybe the wind won't howl. Maybe tomorrow, no one will call your name with suspicion curled around it. Maybe they'll forget to blame you for the frost, but you won't count on it. You never do. The door creaks just a little, just enough. Not the door to the chapel, or the kitchen, or the root cellar, but the one in your head. The door that keeps old questions tucked behind polite nods and long skirts. It opens every so often, usually when your hands are too full to shut it again. And tonight, it's open. Because today, you witness something you can't quite file away with the others. A young girl, no more than 12, led down the village path in a gown she can't yet fill toward a man she's been told to call husband. There were flowers. There were tears. But they weren't the same kind. In the records, what few survive, this is simply marked as a marriage. An agreement between families sealed with land goats or grain. But in the marrow of your bones, you know it's something else. It's the moment a girl steps out of childhood and into duty long before her body is ready, before her mind can map what it means to obey vows she had no part in writing. You remember your own mother tightening the cords of your dress for the first time. You didn't know why it hurt more to stand than to sit that day. Only that from then on, you were expected to carry water with a straight back and a quiet mouth, to knead dough with hands that hadn't yet stopped trembling, to smile when someone older said you were ready for what no one said. But the weight of it settled anyway. They say girls mature faster than boys. They also say the moon is made of milk and fairies steal socks. In medieval logic, a girl becomes a woman not by knowledge or strength or choice, but by cycles and silence. A drop of blood, and suddenly you belong to the realm of expectation. It doesn't matter if you're still learning your letters or afraid of the dark. You are legally and spiritually transformed, just like that. There are debates, quiet ones whispered in corners and under breath, about what age is appropriate. The church speaks of consent, but only in the way a scribe speaks of rain theoretically. Laws are written in Latin, and Latin is written by men. Men who believe that a 12-year-old who can recite her prayers can also bear a household. And so the line between child and wife becomes a smudge, easily erased, rarely corrected. You think of Marjorie, the girl from the next cottage over. She used to hide behind her mother's skirts when strangers passed. Now, She walks with a shuffle in her step, a little limp that no one mentions. Her eyes no longer dart, they stare, like she's already lived more years than her husband will. You tried to bring her broth once. She smiled, but only with the corner of her mouth, like joy was something she didn't have the full strength to lift anymore. And yet people call it growing up. They say she's lucky that one married before the frost, as if timing is the only cruelty worth mentioning, as if the frost is sharper than loneliness, or childbirth, or being touched by someone whose breath smells of beer and entitlement. In your mind, you begin to untangle the knot. When does a girl become a woman? Is it when her father says so? When the priest nods? When the bed is no longer her own? Or is it when she begins to hide her thoughts, even from herself, because thinking hurts more than surviving? The night creeps on. You stir the embers, watching them glow with quiet resentment. They too burn without asking, without choosing. But at least they flicker back when you look. That's something. Later, you'll mend a torn hem in a dress too small for you and too large for the girl it now belongs to. The thread will catch on the fabric stubborn in places, like childhood, like memory. But you'll pull it through anyway, because that's what you do. You stitch the frayed edges. You carry the questions. You make a place for the ones too young to understand what they've given up. And maybe, just maybe, you whisper a different kind of vow that you will remember who they were before the lace veil, that you will keep their laughter somewhere quiet like a secret song, that you will not let the world call this transformation holy without at least one person calling it by its real name, loss disguised as ceremony, duty wrapped in tulle, childhood traded for a cradle. You hear them before you see them. The clatter of boots on cobblestone, the murmur of a crowd that isn't exactly a crowd yet, but will be if you're not careful. You peek through the shutters, keeping your fingers tight on the wood, because today it might matter who's watching. There's a man in the square. He's shouting, not with rage exactly, but with purpose. He has a scroll in one hand and a voice like dried parchment, loud, brittle official. Someone's been accused, and you already know who it is. Not by name, not yet, but you know it's a woman, because it's always a woman. And what's worse, no one needs proof. Not here. Not in a village where stories grow faster than weeds, and logic is something you pick apart only after the damage is done. A few days ago, the baker's daughter tripped while carrying dough to the oven. The fire sputtered oddly. A child caught fever. Someone's cow gave no milk. And suddenly, the whispers began. She was seen collecting herbs at dusk. She hummed to herself. She didn't cry at her mother's funeral. Suspicious, isn't it? You know the rhythm of this story, like you know the back of your hand. It begins with a question disguised as concern. It ends with silence. The kind of silence that stretches between doorways and seeps into prayers. No one speaks in her defense. Not because they agree, but because they don't want to be next. Medieval justice, you see, doesn't need evidence, it needs consensus. A nod here, a murmured agreement there, and suddenly a woman becomes a cautionary tale. You don't even have to be wrong. You just have to be wrong enough for someone else's comfort. And that's dangerously easy to be. Your thoughts drift to the village well, to the market stall, to the edge of the woods, where women gather nettles and rosemary. Any one of them could be next. Even you. because the threshold between healer and heretic is a shallow one. It depends more on timing than truth. And the moment something goes wrong, bad weather sick chickens, an unseasonal hailstorm, people start remembering all the things you did that were a little off. Too much garlic in the stew, too many questions in church, too much confidence. The scroll is read aloud, but the words are mostly theater. The decision was made long before the ink dried. She'll be questioned, though no one really wants answers. She'll be observed, though her fate was sealed the moment her name was said out loud. And she'll be punished for existing slightly outside the expected pattern. The real terror isn't that she's guilty. It's that she never had to be. In another village, this woman might have been midwife or miracle worker. But here, she didn't smile enough, or smiled too much. She stayed home too often, or she was seen walking too late at night. She helped too many people, or maybe she kept too much to herself. And now, the town must cleanse itself by placing the fear on her shoulders. You remember a saying, when there's no explanation, blame a woman. She's convenient. She's nearby. And if she's alone, poor aging, or strange, well, that's practically a confession. It's not the fire, or the stocks, or even the exile that scares you most. It's the shrug of it all. The way people convince themselves it's necessary. The way women learn to walk a little quieter, speak a little softer, pretend they know nothing. Because knowledge has teeth, and women with knowledge are always suspect. You think of your own knowledge, the things you've noticed and never said aloud, the way the stars shift slightly in winter, the recipe that soothes a colicky baby, the story your grandmother whispered when no one else was listening. None of it is dangerous until someone decides it is. And then it's not just stories or scrolls, it's firewood and rope and a very small crowd trying very hard not to look you in the eye. You close the shutter gently, not because you're afraid, not yet, but because you understand how the line is drawn and how fast it moves. Tomorrow, someone will pretend to forget what happened today. They'll say she left for a relative's farm. They'll say she was troubled or sick or strange. And they'll say it with such kindness that it sounds almost true. But you'll remember. You always do. Because remembering is its own quiet rebellion. And in your memory, she was not a witch or a curse or a problem. She was a woman, breathing, thinking, trying. And that too should have been enough. It begins with a job no one wants to name. Not quite a trade, not quite a crime, just a way for women to survive when everything else has been stripped away. You've heard the stories whispered at dusk, the ones with a raised eyebrow and a lowered voice. They don't call her a weaver, or a midwife, or a seller of herbs. They say she does work in the dark. And everyone nods because they understand without understanding. There are women in this village, every village, who slip between the cracks of what's considered respectable. Not because they choose the shadows, but because the daylight never made space for them. Widows with no dowry, mothers with too many mouths to feed, girls too clever to be married off quietly. What society will not bless, it learns to tolerate barely. You might find her in a back alley or behind a curtain in the baker's shop. She doesn't advertise, not exactly, but everyone knows where to find her. When something's broken, an engagement, a secret, a body, people knock on her door. not with judgment, not at first, only desperation. She might help end a pregnancy. She might help summon a vision. She might whisper over bones or stir something bitter into tea. Some of it's just ritual. Some of it works. All of it is dangerous, not because it harms, but because it threatens the order. Men in robes don't like when a woman holds power outside their rules. They don't like when the faithful seek out someone who isn't sanctioned by altar or bishop. They especially don't like when she refuses to be afraid of them. What makes this woman suspicious isn't her work, it's her independence. She doesn't beg. She doesn't flatter. She doesn't apologize. And in a world where women are expected to serve or stay silent, that's nearly heresy. She knows herbs the priest can't name. She knows what mushrooms are safe and how to pack a wound with moss. She knows which prayers are for show and which ones actually work. And she knows that the ones who come to her by night will pretend not to know her by day. You've seen this hypocrisy too many times to count. The merchant's wife who clutches her belly and begs for help but gasps at the idea of gratitude. The scribe who wants a charm to pass exams but would never sit beside her at Mass. They want her gifts, but not her presence. And if something goes wrong, if the sickness lingers or the potion fails, she will pay. With coin, if she's lucky. With silence, if she's smart. With her life, if someone needs a scapegoat and the wind is blowing oddly that week. She lives in a constant state of almost invisible, almost safe, almost forgiven, but never quite. You visited her once, not for anything dramatic, just for advice on how to stop the shaking in your hands after the winter. She made a tea of willow bark and honey, told you to sit with your feet in warm water, told you to rest if rest was possible. You left feeling lighter, not because of magic, but because someone had listened. That too is part of her danger. She listens. She sees things others don't want to see. And she remembers. She remembers which husband hits. She remembers which priest drinks. She remembers which young girl suddenly stopped laughing in the spring and came back a shadow. And though she never speaks it aloud, the knowing is there. In her eyes, in her silence, in the way she presses lavender into your palm as you leave like a benediction no one can forbid. There's a theory you've heard one they don't teach in school or scrawl in holy books, that every village's wisdom lives in one woman. And that woman walks just slightly outside the law, not because she's wicked, but because the law doesn't account for compassion or practicality or pain. And she does. Maybe that's why she stays. Why she risks it. Why she doesn't disappear when the warnings come. Because somewhere deep in the marrow of her being, she believes women should not have to suffer quietly. And even if no one thanks her, especially if no one thanks her, she keeps her door cracked open just in case. You don't say her name out loud, not because it's forbidden, but because it's sacred, like a hymn, like a spell, like a truth that might still get you into trouble if whispered too near the wrong ears. Still, you remember her, and in remembering, you keep her alive. Long after the night swallows the candles, long after the sermons fade, long after the last herbal leaf has turned to dust. There's something about a storm that demands a target. Lightning cracks open the sky, and people flinch, not just from the sound, but from the idea that someone must be to blame. You felt it before in the way eyes turn toward anyone who doesn't quite fit. Anyone who walks differently, speaks softly, or doesn't join the crowd when it kneels. The storm isn't just weather, it's a test. In a time when science is a whisper and weather is a wrathful mood of God, someone must have called it down. And if not the devil himself, then surely someone on speaking terms with him, which is often, inconveniently, a woman. You don't have to summon thunder to be accused of it. You just have to gather rainwater in a jar, or walk barefoot on dewy grass, or forget to make the sign of the cross before milking your goat. That's all it takes. A lapse in ritual, a quirk in habit, a woman not fully understood. There are stories, so many stories, of women blamed for the wind howling too long. A field floods. She glanced at it the day before. A child falls sick. She sang a strange lullaby outside the house. A priest's roof collapses during Mass. She sold him apples the previous market day. The cause and effect logic is paper thin, but fear doesn't need facts. It just needs a face, and that face is usually framed by a veil, worn loosely, or tied improperly, or not worn at all, which is a statement apparently. A wet veil can mean you've been walking in the woods, or speaking to someone you shouldn't, or soaking up too much moonlight, which is practically witchcraft depending on who's watching. They say water remembers. But more often, it's the villagers who remember selectively. And a woman who once argued with a baker is remembered as sharp-tongued. One who asks too many questions in church becomes unsettling. One who weeps during storms is harboring something. No one says what. But that's the point. Storms bring out the ledger keepers, the ones who tally up odd glances and forgotten tithes, and the time she laughed too loud when someone spilled soup. It all adds up. Not to guilt exactly, but to suspicion. And in a place where suspicion is fuel, women are always a spark away from burning. You've learned to stay inside when the clouds gather. Not because of the rain, but because people look for patterns when they're scared. And nothing fits the pattern of chaos better than a woman who walks alone. There's irony in it, of course. That the same people who praise saints for calming storms will curse a midwife for drying herbs by moonlight. That they will pray to female martyrs for mercy and accuse the living of mischief. That the virgin can crush serpents beneath her feet, but a living woman can't even step barefoot in a stream. Once in a neighboring village, you heard of a girl who collected dew before sunrise just for her mother's cough. She didn't speak much, didn't smile often, wore a blue shawl that made her eyes look like sky. When the hail came and the wheat spoiled, they blamed her. They said she must have called it down with that blue cloth tied like a spell. No one asked how she knew about dew's healing, only why she dared to use it, and so it goes. A woman close to nature is a healer until the harvest fails. A woman with silence is a sage until someone dies unexpectedly. A woman with secrets is a comfort until secrets are feared more than pain. You've been careful, so careful. But even that breeds suspicion. Too much caution, they say, means you're hiding something. Too much modesty is theatrical. Too little is defiant. There's no balance beam wide enough to walk safely on, so you keep your face neutral, your words few. You cross yourself when expected, even when you're thinking of nothing but what herbs to gather, or whether your sister's baby will survive the winter. You perform belief as much for protection as for faith. Because storms pass, but accusations tend to linger. The oddest part is deep down, some of them might not even believe it. They know you aren't the cause of the wind or the black rot on the barley, but naming you makes them feel safer, like shouting at the sea. It doesn't stop the tide, but it gives the illusion of control. Still, the weight of that illusion presses on your shoulders, even when you sleep, even when the sky is clear, because a sunny day is only a prologue to the next tempest, and you never know when the questions will start again. You dream of a time when women can watch the clouds and not worry they'll be tied to them, when gathering dew is just an act of care, not an omen, when a blue shawl is just cloth, not a spell. But dreams are soft things, and you've learned to sleep with one eye on the weather. You don't need thunder to feel a storm coming. Sometimes it arrives as a whisper at the market stall, a shift in the way people greet you, less warmth, more watchfulness. It doesn't crash or roar, it creeps. And for women like you, that creeping is far more dangerous than noise. Tonight, there's no wind, just a thick quiet like wool soaked in silence. You sit near the hearth, rubbing mint leaves between your fingers, not for flavor, but for the way it settles the nerves. Mint grows everywhere on roadsides, in garden corners, even between cracks in old stones. Just like suspicion. History often says the Middle Ages were filled with ignorance. But that's not quite right. It was full of belief. Belief so thick and potent it choked out doubt. And when belief needed a scapegoat, women's bodies were the altar. You've seen it in the tales passed down from neighbor to neighbor. The woman whose cows died after she argued with the reeve. The baker's daughter who had red hair and too many opinions. The old midwife who knew how to stop a fever with smoke and sage and paid for it with her reputation. One of the quiet cruelties is how blame becomes inheritance. A mother suspected. Then her daughter is probably strange too. A grandmother whispered about her grandchild is best kept at a distance, even if no one remembers what the original sin was. But the most common offense of all, being a woman at the wrong place at the wrong time while something bad happened. That's it. That's all it takes. Stand too close to a dying pig. Speak too confidently at a town meeting. Carry herbs others don't recognize. The logic is thin, but the judgment is thick. You sometimes think of the saints those women made holy by pain. Catherine with her wheel, Agnes with her purity, Joan with her armor and flames. They were praised for their suffering, not their strength, not their ideas, but their endurance. As if pain was proof of worth. What does that make you then? You endure every day, without altar or relic, without procession or prayer. You suffer in silence and survive without sainthood. The absurd part is some of the same people who blame you would come to you if they needed help. With a sick child, with a difficult birth, with a rash the priest couldn't explain. They would knock on your door at dusk and whisper, "Don't tell anyone I came." And you wouldn't. Because that's what women do, even when we're punished for it. Is it fear that keeps you from leaving? No. It's memory. It's duty. It's the knowledge that if you don't stay, no one will gather the mint. No one will mix the oil. No one will know that storms pass and plagues end, but comfort must be tended like a fire. You look out the window. The night is deep and quiet. In the distance, a dog barks once. A familiar sound. You breathe in. You are still here, You have not vanished into legend. You're not a tale told by firelight. You are real and alive, and holding this fragile thread of history with hands that have worked, healed, and endured. The world may not remember you in scrolls or statues, but it remembers in other ways. In softened wounds, in whispered lullabies, in the stories passed from one woman's mouth to another's ear. Stories that do not need ink, only breath, only belief. And in that, there is power. Not the kind with crowns and swords, but the quiet kind, the rooted kind, the kind that survives centuries and still whispers back when storms begin. And now, the last ember flickers low. You've traveled through centuries with your eyes half closed, carried by stories once whispered behind cloistered walls, beside smoky hearths, and under storm-heavy skies. You've met women whose names were erased, but whose burdens were blamed. You've heard how wind and rain became accusations, how childbirth and herbs turned into trials, how survival itself, quiet, tireless survival, was often mistaken for threat, and yet they endured. In tucked-away corners of the past, they endured. Their strength wasn't sung in ballads or stitched in royal tapestries, but it breathed in kitchens, in fields and dark chapels, where prayers outlasted justice. Perhaps you feel a little closer to them now. Perhaps you recognize some of that weary resilience in your own bones. Maybe you even carry a little of their silence inside you, turned not into fear, but into knowing. Let that be your comfort tonight, that you've listened, that you've remembered, that in this quiet space between waking and sleep, you've become a keeper of lost voices. That's the story. For tonight, may your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.